Doug Powell. I'm always hesitant to have Doug Powell teach for me because whenever he does, what y'all want when I get back is for me to say go on. So you get Doug yet again.
He's so hesitant that I usually don't know till the night before. I got a heads up Thursday night this time, so I had a couple of days on this one. I have, while we've been in Exodus, gone through, I've done a couple of sessions on the biblical archaeology that supports the Exodus. And so we've talked about like the time period where this happened and where the Hebrew slaves were and then where they went and the archaeological evidence for that. Where Sinai is, and it took a couple of different lessons to go through that, and it's certainly not complete for all the evidence, but at one point, Rebecca raised her hand and asked who the Pharaoh of the Exodus was, and I didn't have a good answer. And the reason I didn't have any answer, actually, because what I was really just trying to prove is in the short amount of time that we had that there's good reason to believe that the Exodus was a real historical event and it actually happened, but almost nobody has enough knowledge about Egyptian pharaohs to where if you like hear the name, you're like, oh, that's who it was. You know, like I could say anything and it would just be like equally plausible, right? So it's not like finding out who shot JFK or something like that, where you kind of like, you know, a lot of people are interested and you got to kind of have your own candidate or whatever. So that's not the kind of thing it is. But I have recently expanded this talk for some teaching that I'm about to do. And so I added this in there. So Rebecca, this is just for you. And if you find this incredibly boring, she is to blame right here, Rebecca, right here. Okay, so the way we got to get into it is first we got to get our dating right, because if we don't have the dating right, we can't figure out who the Pharaoh is. So the way the dating works is based on 1 Kings 6:1, which says in the 480th year after the Israelites left Egypt, in the 4th year of Solomon's reign over Israel, he began building the Lord's temple. So if we know Solomon's, the day that he started reigning or the year, then we go 4 years into it. That's when the temple starts being built, and then we go back 480 years. Well, in the 1940s, there was a archaeologist who, I believe it was his dissertation, he did a whole study on synchronizing the archaeological data with the data that we have for the kings of Israel and the kings of Judah and then the judges, and he was able to come up with a standard biblical chronology that almost everybody buys into, okay? So the date of Solomon is 970, so the 4th year of Solomon is 966. That's when the temple starts to be built. So you go back 480 years and you get a date of 1446 for the Exodus. Okay, that's a very straightforward reading of the text. And then you have a couple of corroborative texts. One is from Judges 11:26, which says that Israel has been living in Heshbon and its nearby towns, and in Aroer and its nearby towns, and in all the cities along the Arnon for 300 years. Well, that's during the reign of the judge Jephthah, and so 300 years. If the Exodus was in 1446, then 40 years of desert wandering puts the conquest beginning around 1400, and so 300 years after that's 1100. So it all syncs up like that. The monkey wrench, why this is an issue, comes from Exodus 1:11. Which says, so they put foremen over the Israelites to oppress them with hard labor, and as a result, they built Pithom and Ramesses as store cities for Pharaoh. Now, the reason why this is a little bit of a monkey wrench is because there are Egyptologists and archaeologists who read this passage and they think, well, the reason why you're building a city called Ramesses is because you got a pharaoh called Ramesses. It's kind of like you can't have Trump Tower unless you got a Trump. So they think, well, all right, the problem is that Ramesses is later than 1446. The rule of Ramesses II, which is very long, and he's well known as a builder, it's in the 1200s. So it's about 150, 160 years later after the biblical date of the Exodus. And so they have to try to figure out how to make Ramesses work. And the way they do that is they look at the other relevant text for dating, which is 1 Chronicles 6, 3 through 9, which says that there are 12 generations between Aaron, Moses' brother, and Solomon. So a very common way of thinking about generations in the Bible is that it's 40 years. And the reason why that kind of came about is because in Numbers 13, Moses sends the spies into Canaan to check it out, and they're gone for 40 days. And when they come back, two of the spies are faithful, and they say, they say, it's filled with all this produce, and it's very rich and fertile, but there are big, strong people in the land. But there are two spies who think that's not a problem because God fights and provides for them, and the other spies are like, we don't want any part of that. And the nation of Israel follows the other 10 spies in unbelief. And so God casts judgment on them and says that everybody who's 20 years or older who was freed from Egypt will wander in the desert 1 year for every day the spies were gone until they're all dead. So it takes 40 years for the generation that leaves Egypt to die out. And that's how we get this idea that a generation is 40 years old. So if you have 12 generations in 40 years, then you have 480 years, and that syncs up with the biblical data once again. But the people who think that Ramesses II is the Pharaoh of the Exodus because they're building the city of Ramesses have to recalculate this. And so they think, well, a more common sense generation is about 25 years. That's when people have kids, and 25 times 12 is 300. So you go back 300 years and you end up with the date of 1266 for the Exodus. But then something really weird happens. The people who go to bat for this date then look for archaeological evidence for the Exodus, and there isn't any. And so they say, well, the Bible's not trustworthy. So what they do is they cherry pick only one of the relevant verses. They reinterpret it in a very novel way to get Ramesses II, and then say, because there's no data, you can't trust the Bible. Okay? And it sounds like I'm mischaracterizing it. That's really how this works. But you end up with this confusion about two possible dates for the Exodus. There's really one that the Bible consistently affirms, and it's the earlier one, the 1446. So this leads us to trying to figure out which Pharaoh it would be. And there are a few passages that tell us something about the Pharaoh of the Exodus. One is Exodus 14, 6 through 8, which says that Pharaoh prepared his chariots and took his army with him, and he chased after the Israelites. So Pharaoh doesn't send his army after the Israelites. He leads them. He's with them. He goes with them. All right? So then in verse 28, it says, the water returned and covered the chariots, and not so much of one of them survived. So Pharaoh apparently drowns. He dies with his army. This gets confirmed by Psalm 136:15 that says, the Lord tossed Pharaoh and his army into the sea. So at face value, it looks like that Pharaoh dies in the Red Sea. And this is important because this is the mummy of Ramesses II. And if we have Ramesses II's mummy, then he didn't die in the Red Sea. However, the Bible has no verse that explicitly says that the Pharaoh died. And in fact, it's interesting that the Jewish tradition, so the Jews, their authority, of course, is the Tanakh, the Hebrew Bible, but they also have oral tradition that then begins to be written down a couple hundred years after the crucifixion. And so this gets collected together, this oral law, mostly in the Talmud. So the Talmud has some things that kind of detail, kind of cash out the law, the legal parts of the oral tradition. So like how far you could walk on the Sabbath, that gets included in that. But there's another part of the oral tradition that is called the Haggadah, and these are stories and legends that kind of give background information to what you read in Scripture. And a lot of times these are really just kind of Jewish legends. So somewhere between about 500 AD and 1200 AD, you have a Haggadah that says that Pharaoh did not die in the Exodus. And in fact, what it says is that as the Hebrews are on the other side and safely in Midian now, and the waters have covered the army, the only surviving Egyptian is Pharaoh, and he's floating in the water, and he's proclaiming his belief in God at this point. And Gabriel comes down with a big chain and basically says, too late for that. And he puts Pharaoh in chains, and he sinks him to the bottom of the Red Sea for 50 days and tortures him. And then he releases him, and he installs him as the king of Nineveh, that he rules for 500 years until Jonah comes. Okay? So that's the kind of crazy legend you end up with Pharaoh living. Another part of the legend says that Pharaoh stands right now at the gates of hell. And he is the person that the rulers of this world, the kings and the rulers who are unbelievers, who are rulers of this world, first meet when they get to hell, because he's standing there as the saying, I was the example. I was what you shouldn't have done. You should have taken my example and not, as something not to do, is not to oppose God. And so he condemns all the leaders of the world as they come into hell. So at least some Jewish tradition says he lives. And again, there's no explicit verse that says he dies, but it looks at face value as if Pharaoh has died. Okay, so regarding the whole Ramesses, the city thing, Ramesses turns out to be a city that is very ancient, so ancient that it has a number of layers and a number of different names. And at the time the Hebrew slaves lived in Ramesses, it wasn't called Ramesses, it was called Avaris. And it was called Avaris going all the way back to at least the time when the Hebrews first get to Egypt. And so it's not that this city is called Ramesses. This city exists prior to Ramesses II. I don't know when the name change comes, but it's not like they're building a city of Ramesses because there's a pharaoh named Ramesses. The city pre-exists. And so the reason why we read Ramesses in Genesis and in Exodus is probably, we don't know for sure, but it's probably because during the Babylonian captivity, when the temple was destroyed and the Hebrew scriptures became so important to the Jews to preserve in order to keep their identity as the people of God, that they updated place names so that people would know they were talking about real places. And at that time, it's known as Ramesses, and so they update the names. And this happens, looks like it, not just here, but in a couple different places throughout the Old Testament. So it's probably like, if you were writing a history right now of Istanbul, you just call it Istanbul, even though you may be talking about a time period when it was called Constantinople. That's all this is, all right? So that gets us to the chronology, which is a little on the tedious and squishy side, but we've got to do it if we're going to name the Pharaoh of the Exodus. So the way we get the Egyptian chronology is there are three primary sources for it. One is an Egyptian priest in the 3rd century BC named Manetho, and he writes a history that contains 30 different Egyptian dynasties, and he lists all the kings and he lists all the rules, except that we've lost part of his work. So it's fragmentary what we have, but it's the most comprehensive that we have. And then we have, to fill in some of the blanks, there are other ancient historians that are important that quote Manetho, and so they can fill in some of the pieces. So like Josephus, the 1st century Jewish historian, or Eusebius, the 4th century Christian historian and bishop, they can fill in parts of Manetho. So he's very important. Then you have something from the 13th century BC called the Turin Papyrus. So there's actually a piece of papyrus that's over 3,000 years old that survived that is a list of the Egyptian kings, and it contains the list of them throughout the first 17 dynasties. But it's a piece of papyrus, so it's in fragments as well. So we've lost chunks of that. And then we have one other place called Abydos, which is in Egypt. And there's a temple there, and inscribed on the wall are the first 19 dynasties, the names of the kings in the first 19 dynasties, except that's not complete either, because it's missing the 13th through 17th dynasties. So it is somewhat incomplete as well. But that is enough data, even though it's fragmentary, to where you can make a pretty good guess at the Egyptian chronology. And you can see that part of the issue is when it's like linear, it goes from dynasty 13 to dynasty 17. This is the kind of how it works linearly. And then dynasties 14, 15, and 16 are like local kings or outside invaders that have come in but not conquered the whole land, stuff like that. So you have kind of concurrent dynasties here that make it a little bit messy. And then on top of that is how the calendar works. So the way the calendar works is when you spot the star Sothis rising in the sky. And we know this because there's an ancient piece of papyrus that tells us this is exactly how the calendar works. However, where you spot the star rising depends on where you are in Egypt. So it might be Memphis, it might be Alexandria, it might be Thebes. Okay, there's Egyptologists who hold to all these things, and whichever one you pick, it scooches the timeline a little bit forward and back. So this is why it's not like super locked in stone, as it were. But there's a first century AD Egyptian historian who says that at that time it was observed in Alexandria, and prior to that it had been observed in Memphis. So there's only one way of understanding the Egyptian chronology that syncs up with observing the Sothic rise in Memphis, and we call this the high chronology. And so biblical archaeologists use the high chronology, and these are the dates I'm going to give you, are the high chronology dates. Because this one is the one that works best, both for the Egyptian and the biblical calendar, the biblical dating. If you use a middle or low view, those are your other options, then it shifts the Egyptian chronology forward closer to our time by between 20 and 50 years, and that changes who the Pharaoh is. Okay? So this means there are 4 or 5 answers, Rebecca, to who the Pharaoh of the Exodus is. Answer number 1 is the whole thing is made up and it is a myth. There was no Exodus, therefore there is no Pharaoh. Okay, this is the least evidenced answer you got, because you have all these details about the Exodus and the timeline and everything in the Bible, and plus we have archaeological evidence that support it as well. So that one doesn't go very well. Then you got option number 2. This is Ramesses II. The problem here is, we've already worked through this, it doesn't make sense of the biblical data. And it doesn't make sense of the archaeological data that we also have. We've gone over some of that as well. Number 3 is Amenhotep II. See how unexciting that is when I tell you the name of the Pharaoh of the Exodus. It's not like, that's exactly who I thought it was. So Amenhotep II is probably the guy. When you use the high chronology, high view of the Egyptian chronology, it lands at Amenhotep II. If you use the middle or low view, it's Thutmose III, and he is the father of Amenhotep II. Interestingly, Amenhotep II is not the firstborn son of Thutmose III, which fits right in with the plagues of the Bible. And neither does Amenhotep's firstborn son succeed him either. So that fits pretty good. Here's the problem with Thutmose III. We have his mummy. So if Thutmose III is the Pharaoh of the Exodus, then Pharaoh survives the Exodus and lives out his reign. If Amenhotep II is the Pharaoh of the Exodus, we also have a problem because we have his mummy, which means he survived the Exodus as well. However, there's a caveat, and this is a super cool caveat that doesn't apply to any other pharaoh. When pharaohs start reigning, they start building monuments to themselves, and these things are called stela or steles, and they brag about things like military conquests. And so almost all the pharaohs have these stelas. They look like giant tombstones that have these inscriptions that say when their first successful military conquest was, and it includes the date of when it was, of when they ascended to the throne. And Amenhotep II is unique among all pharaohs because he has 2 first conquest stelae. So, and the weird thing is, so they both mark his first successful military conquest, but they give different dates, and they both give his Ascension Day, and they give different dates, but they're both for Amenhotep II. So this is super confusing because, like I said, there's nobody else like that and among the Egyptian pharaohs. So there is a theory that is gaining traction that, one other thing you got to know about these 2 stela. The older one is from the year 1448. That's 2 years before the Exodus. The other one is from the year 1444, 2 years after the Exodus. So right in the middle between these 2 first conquest steles is the date of the Exodus. So the theory is that because Pharaoh was defeated by Hebrew slaves without even an arrow shot their direction by them, because it's such a humiliating defeat for the most powerful army on earth at that time, and because Egyptian kings and kings in ancient history write revisionist history, they want to make themselves look powerful, that this event gets ignored, and that there are 2 Amenhotep IIs, and the second one takes the regal name of the first one in order to kind of erase this incident that the Egyptian army was wiped out without even a battle taking place. It's just too humiliating. And they don't want to record it in any way. So either one of his sons or his grandsons, Amenhotep II, rules in his father's place using his father's name, and we only have 1 mummy, but we have 2 ascension dates and 2 first conquest stelae. So it makes everything fit. That's about as good as we got. So if he dies, then the first Amenhotep would be the one who dies in the Red Sea, and then the second one rules in his place. Okay, so you still get Amenhotep II, or he doesn't die in the Red Sea. But Amenhotep II is the one who hits on the date. So there's a 4th option, and we talked a little bit about this one last time. And this is the revised chronology. And in the revised chronology, there is kind of a reassessment of how everything is being understood in Manetho in particular. And so when the dates are recalculated, there's kind of a time compression it's more compressed the further back you get. So it's as much as 150 or 200 years. And in this revised chronology, the end of the 13th dynasty is 1446, and the pharaoh at that time is named Titimius, and that is actually who Manetho says is the pharaoh of the Exodus. So that fits pretty good. The problem here is that even though you solve this question, the revised chronology, it's like dominoes. Okay, you solve this one, but it creates more problems in trying to reconcile the kings and the archaeological data the further you get. So it creates more problems than it solves, but the one problem that it solves is it gives you a hard name for the Pharaoh of the Exodus. So among biblical archaeologists right now, by far the most favorable candidate is Amenhotep II. That's the answer. You're welcome, Rebecca. Kevin?
Is that the King Tut that we had going through?
It is not. King Tut's very, very minor. Very minor. But what it means is Tutmos I would be the Pharaoh who says kill all the Hebrew babies. And then his daughter is Queen Hatshepsut, and she marries her half-brother, which is Tutmos II, who dies very early in his reign, but they have a baby, and that's Tutmos III. And she is the co-regent for 20 or 22 years or so until she dies. And Tutmos III is the Pharaoh who is so harsh to the Jews and is the Pharaoh during the plagues and all of that. Tutmos III is the one who's harsh to the Jews and Moses has to run from. And then his son Amenhotep the second is who the Pharaoh of the Red Sea is. There's one more thing. I know we've got other stuff to do, but I want to tell you one other piece that's kind of interesting in this. And these are called the Amarna letters. These were found in the 1890s at a place called Tel El Amarna in Egypt. There are 382 of these, and about over 150 of them are written between Amenhotep III, that's the grandson of Amenhotep II, the grandson, Amenhotep III, and the Canaanite kings. And the time period is between 1400 and 1300. So it's during the time period when the conquest would have happened. And what these are letters. These tablets are maybe 6 inches at the most tall. And they're letters from Canaanite kings to Amenhotep III saying the Hebrews are attacking them and they want help. Okay, so it's Amenhotep III's response to it. So you have a corroboration of the conquest, which then also corroborates the 1446 date as well. So was there another question over here? Yes?
How do you know Ramses I doesn't figure into this chronology?
How the what?
You immediately went to Ramses II. How do we know Ramses I couldn't be the one who's referenced first?
He doesn't go back that far. He doesn't immediately precede the second, but he doesn't go even as far back as Amenhotep or anything like that. And in Genesis, when Joseph moves everybody to Egypt, it actually says Ramesses. That's where they go. But it wouldn't be Ramesses at that time, it's Avaris. So, all right, any other questions before, yes?
Doug, just to be precise, so we're talking about Amenhotep II the first or the first second?
They differentiate it numerically. It's 2A and 2B. So 2A would be Pharaoh of the Exodus. We don't have a mummy for him. 2B is the one who succeeds him and rules in 2A's place. If that theory is accurate, we don't know.
I have my words right when I'm getting
Yes, yeah. You don't want double numbers. You want to go number letter 2A 2B. Yes, Dan.
So the Ramses, many biblical Ramses, was more from a location as opposed to.
It's both a location and it's a person, but the location existed before it was called Ramses. So that's where you get. All right. Thank you.
Y'all, how blessed is the church are we? How blessed is the church are we that, Doug's one of our elders here at Christ Fest. The PCA ruling elder. We go way, way back. But to have this level of insight and research and acumen, Doug's working on his PhD right now. I don't know if you all are aware of that. He's working on his doctorate. And that'll be, what are you thinking in terms of hoping to finish that? What's the timeline?
2 years from now?
2 years from now. So just a great gift to our church is Doug Powell. And, you know, not just his acumen, but his heart, one of the finest, godliest men I've ever known in my life. And so it's just a treat for us to be able to hear him. And we're going to be hearing more of him. Less of me, more of him in the weeks ahead, I think is what I would like to hear. Doug, thank you so very much. I think about all the attacks on Christianity. I follow a host of atheistic Instagram accounts and so forth, and I'm just glad there's folks like Doug who can take up the battle and stand on the front line for us. I want to ask, right? Yeah.
Doug, are you going to be writing your dissertation on Pharoh of the Exodus?
No way.
No, you've got to write it, and the title should be To Be or Not to Be.
Oh my goodness, you been cooking that one down. You were waiting for just one. That's pretty good, though. I got that's pretty good. That's pretty good. You know, Doug does have, though, his Graham Elliott series of sort of historical fiction, biblical archaeology texts that he's written, 4 of them. And they've just been re-released now with pictures from some of your travels and so forth. So here's the deal. We're going to have a set of all 4 of those at our Christmas extravaganza that we will give away. And we'll figure out how we're going to give them away, what's going to be the way that you'll win that. But that'll be a great stocking stuffer if you want to get those books, put something under the tree for someone this Christmas. So we'll make sure we get those in front of you so you can buy the updated editions of those.